Today on Tricrow Studios, we do a high gain amp shootout between the Marshall MA100H and the Marshall DSL 100HR. This replaced this. Now, we'd like to reiterate here that this is a high gain amp shootout, so you're not going to hear any cleans, you're not going to hear any breakups. It's all high gain geared towards metal. I would also like to state that both amps are actually using an Ibanez TS9 to boost the signal. I feel that with the MA100H, it is required, but you wouldn't generally do that with the DSL 100HR, but it just sounded better when I was doing the recordings. But I do have two sound samples for you today, the first of which is in drop C. That's a somewhat balanced EQ type setting, whereas the second of which is in drop B, and that is a more scoop type setting. All right, so there you go. They are the two sound samples for the high gain amp shootout between the Marshall MA100H and what replaced it in the lineup, the Marshall DSL 100HR, which is kind of like a revisit of the Marshall JCM 2000 DSL 100, but it has resonance controls rather than that deep switch, and digital reverb rather than the beautiful spring reverb that was in the JCM 2000. So it's at this point in the video where I do like to go over what I've gained from doing a shootout like this. And this is one of those shootouts that I didn't really think about. Just because the Marshall MA series, I always looked at it as like an overdrive type amp. Because it's not geared towards high gain, which I think is why it didn't really pan out. It wasn't around for too long, and it didn't really get a lot of praise for its abilities. But because it does have that crunch balance, which I found favorable to actually have sitting around like 10 o'clock, just it allowed the gain not to take over, which at that point would really increase some of the high end or the high mids rather than the high end, and it would just kind of destroy the signal. But because it does have that crunch balance, you can get an excellent overdriven tone. So if you're looking to do like you know, light rock, maybe a little bit of blues, if you're just a lead guitar player, the MA100H, fantastic amp. But if you're a rhythm player, especially for high gain, you might want to look elsewhere. The DSL 100HR, it's a fantastic budget amp, which I don't know if it can be considered a budget amp now after the whole pandemic. Did you know people call it the pandy? That's stupid. But after the whole pandemic and the shortages everywhere, I'm not sure what price range this amp is. It may be in the 2000s now, where it should be sitting around like, I don't know, 1,000 or 1,200 brand new. But I'm just not sure where it is after the whole pandemic and everything's skyrocketing. But either way, what I figured I would hear is an amp struggling with getting into a lot of low end and high end, high gain, and an amp just really giving a lot of satisfying low end, high mids, and high end. And that's kind of what you heard. So if you're going to describe the MA100H as sounding a little bit boxy with some misplaced mids, it was really hard to get that out of there. Anytime that I would go through and try to get a setting that I was very happy with, it would just turn out that the mids were flubby and overtaking, and was not really a really good way to kind of fix that. Also, the low end seemed to disappear, especially in direct comparison to the DSL 100HR. It wasn't something that was there. It was something that the low end and the low mids kind of melded together, and not in the most pleasing way. I do have to say, a lot of the amps that I find in shootouts when they tend to struggle to be consistent, I guess you would say, in like a balanced EQ type setting, those ones where you really have to push the high end in order to make it sound a little nicer, they really start to perform a lot better in a scoop type setting. So I did find that the MA100H performed a lot better than it did. I sounded like I said performed. Performed a lot better than it did in the balanced EQ type setting. There you go. That's really the comparison in a nutshell. An amp that I don't think was ever geared towards high gain versus an amp that was brought back to the market in a different way to replace the amp that wasn't geared towards high gain. I think that's really where the MA100H had its confusion in the lineup, because a lot of people, they think Marshall, they think high gain. Whereas personally, if I hear Marshall, especially one with a spring reverb, first thing I'm thinking of is a little bit of breakup, and grabbing a Gretsch, to be honest. That's usually what I think of when I hear a Marshall, especially with spring reverb. But I think that's why this amp didn't really pan out, and this amp, though it does apparently have some reliability issues, the DSL 100HR, I've heard, I haven't experienced. But, I think this was the best replacement for the MA100H that Marshall could get, without kind of like clearing up the confusion in their lineup. Anyway, thanks for watching.